at this banquet in 213 BC was the master of the archers, a man named Zhou Qiao. All these things are being put into these images and never. Well, the first emperor of China is fascinating to a lot of people. He's a very enigmatic figure of which we have very little historical information except for one key historical account. And of course, everyone is interested in the first emperor because of the artifacts that come from his tomb. The terracotta warriors who have been on exhibit almost perpetually since 1980 in some museum around the world have drawn millions of tourists to Xi'an and have made people extremely interested in this figure, the first emperor. In 213 BC, according to the Shiji, or historical records, our sole historical account of the Qin dynasty of China, the first emperor hosted a large banquet in the imperial palace, attended by his 70 court academicians. The man of the hour was, of course, the first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huangdi, who had become king in 246 BC, and building upon the work of his ancestors, annexed the last of the 6 rival warring kingdoms in 221 BC to form a single empire. The state of China under the first emperor, going back at least to his ancestors in the state of Qin, relied on a legalist philosophy, or at least legalism is what we would call it today, that promoted the authority of the ruler, the absolute autocratic authority of the ruler, and promoted the idea of severe punishments for even the smallest crimes. And the remnants of the Qin law code, which have been found in the last few decades, definitely prove that even for small crimes of theft could result in mutilation and multiple years in labor camps or even execution. And so there was definitely a culture of violence and punishment. These punishments range from having your nose cut off, your feet cut off, horrible mutilations, to severe labor and beatings. And so there was definitely a culture of violence, and this was thought, of course, to have a deterrent effect. The legalist philosophers said that if everything was against the law, no law would be broken. And if the coin was dropped in the road, no one would pick it up, for they feared it would be against the law. And so it was definitely deterrence through terror that ruled the state. And as Qin conquered all the territories that were later to make up China, they imposed these sets of laws on these territories, which didn't have these kind of laws before. We know from fragments of their laws that they had more customary laws decided by judges, and that things were not quite as harsh. And so there was definitely a culture of violence. And of course, the unification of China required tremendous violence because these other states were not going to give up their sovereignty voluntarily. And so it's been estimated that as many as 1 million men may have died in battle in these conquests. And even if these figures are overestimates in the accounts, it's at least 50% of that. So we're looking at hundreds of thousands of people dying, cities destroyed, populations massacred. Now those bitter wars of annihilation and annexation had carried on for more than a century. And even after unification, resistance to the new order was apparently strong. Now the first man to toast the emperor at this banquet in 213 BC was the master of the archers, a man named Zhou Qingchen. In an effusive toast, he lauded the first emperor's achievements in the grandest terms. Then, a man named Chen Yuyue stepped forward. He was a court academician from Qi, most likely a specialist in Confucian texts. He blasted Zhou Qingchen for flattering the emperor directly to his face, and then launched in on a tendentious lecture on how the Qin had made a fatal mistake in eliminating the old feudal system, created by the Shang and Zhou dynasties, to impose a completely centralized administration. His reaction was violent and swift, though not entirely unpredictable. Through his mouthpiece, and some would argue the true architect of his regime, the Prime Minister Li Si, we hear a long speech of denunciation, in which the ultimate targets are the reactionary ideas held in books. It is only because books still existed, which glorified the supposed golden age of the Western Zhou dynasty, or recorded the political philosophies other than the legalist one espoused by the Qin, that resistance to the new system still survived. Li Si then stated, and I quote, "I therefore request that all official historical records other than those of the state of Qin be burned, with the exception of the academicians, whose duty it is to possess them. If there are persons anywhere in the empire who have in their possessions copies of the Book of Songs, or the Book of Documents, or the writings of the 100 schools of philosophy, They shall in all cases deliver them to the governor or the commandant for burning. Anyone who ventures to discuss the songs or the documents shall be executed in the marketplace. Anyone who uses antiquity to criticize the present shall be executed along with his whole family. Any official who observes or knows of a violation and fails to report it shall share the same crime. Anyone who has failed to burn such books within 30 days shall be subjected to tattooing on the face and building walls for 5 years. The books that are exempted are those on medicine, divination, agriculture, and forestry. So this was the infamous burning of the books, fan shu, and it was undoubtedly carried out, though how effectively it was enforced we cannot be certain. But the first emperor, of course, was said to rule the same way he conquered, which was through violence and killing, and that the old adage that you can, of course, conquer the empire on horseback, but you can't rule it on horseback, was used against him, that he didn't change his mode of ruling to treat his own people as his allies rather than his enemies. Now, 1 year later, in 212 BC, the emperor reacted violently once again to a challenge to his authority and prestige. Two of his court wizards, Master Lu and Master Ho, who were commissioned to discover the elixir of immortality, slandered the emperor and fled in secret. An investigation followed in which numerous court scholars and wizards implicated each other. 460 men were charged with violating various laws and were executed in the capital. Our historical text says that they were kung, a word which as a noun means a pit, and as a verb could mean simply to execute, to trap and kill, or to literally pit them, to bury them alive in a pit. This was the equally famous burying of the scholars, or killing of the scholars, kung ru. Among the atrocities of the Qin said to turn heaven and the people against it, foremost among them, according to later critics, were the burning of the books and the killing of the scholars. These two events, historically almost unrelated, later became wedded together into a set four-character phrase, fan shu kung ru, burning the books and killing the scholars, that forms a shorthand for alluding to the atrocities committed by a tyrant, a wanton destruction of culture and the brutal slaughter of the learned. Many of the critics of the first emperor say that his great fault, of course, was not what he did to unify China, but that he didn't change his mode once he had won. At this banquet in 213 BC was the master of the archery commanding Zhou Qiao. All these things are being put into these images and never... The burning of the books and the killing of the scholars were said to have taken place in 2 successive years, late in the reign of the first emperor. The burning of the books definitely did occur. We have several pieces of independent evidence that this burning of the books did occur. We have authors from the succeeding century who all complained of this event and this destruction of literature. And we have the actual title of the law and the text of the law and the mention of the law being repealed later on in the Han Dynasty. Now, the killing of the scholars is a different matter. The killing of the scholars, we don't have any independent historical evidence that it actually occurred from the time around 200 BC or 212 when it was supposed to have taken place. It's not mentioned at all until a historical account more than a century after it happened. And the critics from the previous century never mentioned it at all. They mentioned the burning of the books, but never mentioned the killing of the scholars. And my theory that I present in this talk is that it's based on legends, based on oral history and legends that by the time of the historian Sima Qian had taken the shape of historical fact. But the history is kind of hard to verify, of course. We don't have the actual scholars. But in the Tang Dynasty, of course, they believe they found the pit where they were killed. For during the Tang Dynasty, an actual physical site was identified where legend had said that the killing of the scholars was supposed to have taken place. During Tang times, the location was originally called Ma'agu, Valley of the Horses. A Tang commentator said that a tomb cut into the western bank of this ravine is the group burial of the scholars from the Qin. But archaeology has yet to verify or deny this. Now, local villagers today call this place Guigu, the ravine of the ghosts. And you see it here on your screen near Xi'an. It is located a few miles from modern Xi'an City in Lintong County, just south of Hongqingbao village. Locals relate that around 50 years ago, many human skulls were unearthed from the ravine, enough to fill an entire truckload, according to one account. Locals also repeated a different legend that said the first emperor of Qin killed the scholars by hitting them in the head with a board embedded with iron nails. Other scholars reported finding a deposit of more than 30 centimeters of bone debris at the bottom of this ravine. But it's true that the first emperor was a vengeful and paranoid individual who did kill people who opposed him. And it's quite likely that anyone who opposed him would be executed by the first emperor. But it's uncertain whether these 460 men who were killed were actually 460 or 700, as other accounts say, or whether they were all Confucians. It seems likely that they were all sorts of scholars, including wizards, alchemists, chefs, all sorts of masters of technique. One of the greatest historical problems with the killing of the scholars incident is that, unlike the burning of the books, there is really no independent historical evidence confirming that it actually happened. We only have a detailed mention of it in our one Sima Qian account, the Shiji or historical records, and that account dates to more than a century after the Qin. Among the writers of the earlier Han dynasty, like Lu Jia or Jia Yi, who both enumerated the faults of the Qin, none mention this incident at all. It is possible that, like many of the fantastic tales of the first emperor that found their way into Sima Qian's account in the Shiji, that the killing of the scholars incident began as a sort of urban legend, possibly with some basis in fact, and was handed down orally until it was incorporated by Sima Qian into his history, taking on the guise of incontrovertible fact. At best, the incident is apocryphal. It is certainly not historical. In addition, the original written account does not say that the condemned men were all Confucian scholars, as the later martyr legend would have us believe. In fact, they were all said to be scholars of many types, various masters, zhusheng, including probably wizards, alchemists, doctors, culinary specialists, and specialists in other texts. Now, part of the reason for the transformation of the wizards into Confucians is because in the original account, the crown prince, Fu Su, when pleading for the condemned men, is made to say that, quote, the scholars all take Confucius as their model, unquote. While there may have been some Confucian scholars in that group of 460 implicated men, most were probably wizards and alchemists like Master Lu and Master Ho, whose original slander and deception had brought down the first emperor's wrath. Well, I think the burning of the books and the killing of the scholars fascinates the minds of many people. For those in the West, as I argue in the talk, it brings up thoughts of Nazi book burning in the 1930s, of fights against fascism and other literary purges. So in the Western mentality, it brings up an entirely different ghost from our own past. In China, of course, it brings up the whole debate about the first emperor. Was he a tyrant? Was he a brutal despot? Or was he a destroyer of the old to bring about the glorious new culture? And so I think the idea of destroying books means different things to different people in different social constructs. But the killing of the scholars, of course, is a dramatic episode. And even if it never occurred, many cinematographers want to portray it because of just the dramatic possibilities of this live burial. And I show in the talk some of the different ways that people have approached showing this event. Even if it didn't actually occur, it hasn't stopped them from trying to put it on film.